Hello. Um, Welcome. My name is Fred Davey. I am Executive Vice President of Union Theological Seminary, which is just across the street here. I'm going to start by saying I feel like I'm completely out of my element. I'm a Presbyterian minister, and we spend time across the street dealing with issues of sort of meaning and social justice. And Esther said in the previous panel, for those who were here, that perhaps this should be a panel on government and regulations as it relates to technology. I'm beginning to feel like there should be a panel on religion, faith, and values as it relates to technology, but that's for another time. Our job here today is to look at the way the world is changing because of the internet and these new technologies that seem to be emerging daily in various forms and facets. And on this panel, we hope to explore briefly the impact of technology, as you saw in the film, on human interactions and engagements. Everything from dating virtually to sex with robots to artificial intelligence and the production of the so-called useless class to social media and criminal gang activity, for starters. And we're supposed to do all that in an hour, including having our panelists give us 5-minute presentations apiece and then talk a little bit among themselves and then do some Q&A with you. So let's see how we do. But let's get started, and we'll get started with our panelists. The first panelist we have here is Todd Richmond. He is Director of Party Ran Tech and Narrative Lab and Director of USC's Mixed Reality Lab. So, Todd.
Hello? There we go. Okay, just to let you know, I'm not checking my email, I'm timing myself for 5 minutes. So, we live in complex times, and complexity requires two main skills. One is abstraction, the other is representation. It's the only way that you can deal with complex problems. Trained as a scientist, I learned those things actually kind of along the way. I never was explicitly taught it. Turns out there are fields that do study that, so I advise you maybe to do what I did, which was marry an artist, because it turns out that artists have thought deeply about abstraction and representation. Key to that is conceptual models. So let me give you two conceptual models for the way that I frame the world, and I think it's helpful for thinking about how all of this human and digital and virtual stuff works. The first is that technology fundamentally breaks time and space. And what that means is we've gone from a world where humans are physically co-located and have real-time communication to now you can be not physically co-located and have a real-time communication, or you have asynchronous communication. And as humans, it's difficult, I think, for us to make that transition. We've learned our way around it, but fundamentally we want to be in the same room at the same time, because then our brain doesn't have to fill in a bunch of gaps. And that's the problem that technology does, is it gives you a lot of gaps that your mind fills in. The second conceptual model is that I believe there are no solutions. So this is a callback to the last group. The best that we can get in this world is an emulsion. So trigger warning if you studied chemistry. An emulsion is, for instance, oil and vinegar do not mix. If you shake them up, they will separate the minute you stop shaking them. So that's the way I view humans and digital technology. Humans are analog, real time, we're born, we live, we die. Digital is at its heart zeros and ones. It's on, off, it's black and white. I consider those orthogonal. So you can't form a solution. You have an emulsion. So as long as you're shaking the human and the analog, meaning I'm looking at my phone, I'm checking my computer, it seems like it's all mixed together. But the minute I leave my phone at home, God forbid I forget it when I go to work, all of that digital stuff actually separates out. So what happens when you add egg yolk to oil and vinegar? Mayonnaise. Mayonnaise is not a solution, it's a stable emulsion. That egg yolk has formed a binding agent between the oil and vinegar. So what I spend my time doing is looking for egg yolk in the technology world. I believe that story is one of those binding agents, and it's the reason that Instagram changed their feed to have stories. Stories is how we engage the world in information. I believe play is another thing, and addiction goes along with play. Addiction was mentioned briefly. And then the third is policy, and it's the reason I first left my chemistry faculty position and went to work in digital media, and now I'm at a cinema school, but I've moved to a public policy school because we have technology companies dictating policy ad hoc, driven by profit, and that is a very dangerous world to live in.
Thank you. Next on our panel is Soraya Chimley, who is the director of the Women's Study Media Center Speech Project and organizer of the Safety and Free Speech Coalition, both involved with curbing online abuse, and she's also the author of Rage Becomes Her, The Power of Women's Anger. Soraya.
Thank you. I'm going to do what Adrian said not to do and drain my cognitive resources by reading from my phone. I'm really interested in the direction that our conversations have taken for two reasons. One is we haven't talked about money, and I don't know how to have these conversations without talking about money. And the second is that I'm interested in how technology affects cognition, but I'm much more interested in how cognition affects technology. And so we just saw some clips from a movie about dating apps. And I would argue that the logic of dating apps that sometimes disturbs people who are worried about sex and tech, certainly when you put sex and tech together, is the logic of the internet for a variety of reasons. One is that we can see in dating apps how biases in the culture work. So in most dating apps, the people who are most rewarded, if you're men, are white men peak age 50, which means that, in fact, aging through a dating app is optimized for white men, right? The peak age for women is 18. If you are a black woman, you are literally, if not harassed off of the app, pretty much left alone, right? So we can see in these apps how racial and gender biases work. Not necessarily because they are uniquely producing these, because they do produce them, but because they reflect them and then amplify them at scale. The other thing about a dating app is that it reflects the degree to which sex is considered transactional and women are considered products and property. So if we think about rape culture, we know that in our culture, rape has never really been considered a human rights violation, regardless of who it's happening to, and that it is legally based on the idea of property. And in the United States, black women historically could not be raped because they were property. White married women could not be raped because they were their husband's property. The last marital rape law was passed in this country in 1992, and there are still many people in the country who do not acknowledge that it's valid, right? And so we see in the sexual objectification principle of dating apps this quality of shopping, right? And the quality of sex being transactional, of something you take from someone or get from someone, you were rewarded. And in that model, women have historically been the prizes that men are rewarded with. So I don't think that it's a big leap to say that when products, not just dating apps, are born of the imagination of elite young white men with sexual entitlement who are being overfunded by older elite white men to experiment with society, that we end up with these problems that we're talking about, right? And so the other thing too is that we see in these apps a really meaningful shift from learning through text and learning through image. So that's sort of happening in one dimension. We're about to leap dimensions, right? We're literally going to have these immersive experiences, and we're not talking as a society about what it means to perceive the world in these ways or to derive knowledge about the world around us in that shift. And so we see that a lot in dating apps, but I would say we see it everywhere. It's also gamified, right? There are ranks and ratings, and it's a toy. You know, you're sort of flipping and you're being rewarded, and that's evident in virtually all of these systems. So I use Twitter all the time. I'm a journalist, and Twitter, for example, verifies people. Now, in theory, verification is a good thing if you're a public figure. But in fact, if you're a woman, verification is not good for you because it is a visible signal that you have higher status, which literally brings out misogynistic and racist people who would like to put you in your place regularly, right? So what we see happening on dating apps is a sort of microcosm of what happens in these other spaces. And we have, I think, a fake distinction between public and private. The technology is dissolving that, and sometimes that's good. So for women and women's rights, we have the ability to shine a light on private topics that were mired in shame and not considered family-friendly in mainstream media, and we can shed light on those images, on those issues. We can talk about rape, we can talk about pregnancy, we can talk about abortion, all of these efforts to destigmatize women's lives, right? But at the same time, we experience in the same dissolution between public and private, the fact that our vulnerabilities then become institutional vulnerabilities. So I, as a journalist, for example, I'm married, I'm not on dating apps, but every morning when I open my inbox, I'm flooded by messages from men I don't know. And those men might be saying hi, or they might be sending me videos of themselves masturbating, or they might be threatening to rape me. So my experience as a woman professional journalist is radically different, I would argue, from, say, a journalist who's a man, like James Fallows yesterday was here. I bet our inboxes are pretty different, right? And so the issue is when we talk about any of these, where we're talking about threats to democracy or what this means in terms of our social values, I would argue that what we're really talking about is who perceives risk, who decides what's normal, and how do we then deal with that risk. And one of the biggest issues I think we have is around this issue of identity protective cognition in society. So when I say any of those things, I can say these systems reflect biases, and when we talk about, we have market forces, and there are hierarchies that we need to deal with. I can use that kind of language, or I can literally say, if I go sort of feminist wonky, I can say we have a white male supremacist heteropatriarchal capitalist society that is exploitative and that is systematized in virtually every aspect of our lives, and we won't use the right language to do that, because when I say that, I'm the aggressor. That makes me aggressive. It makes me threatening. And when women talk about Me Too, when the vast majority of women are sharing Me Too stories, right? When we incur huge costs just to navigate the threat of male violence, online or off, it is identity protective for men to deny that, to say you're exaggerating. It's not as bad as you're saying. It didn't really happen that way. Maybe he was just joking. There are all of these defense mechanisms because, in fact, we prioritize the protection of masculine ideals over the safety and experiences and needs of children and women. And that's not just true in dating apps. It's true in all of these apps. So that's what I think about Swiped.
I'm sure there'll be more to say about that later, and probably plenty of questions for you as well. But before we get to that, we will hear from Robin Stevens, who is the Director of Health Equity and Media Lab at UPenn Nursing School, studying the interaction between the online and offline social worlds and risk behaviors among youth of color. Robin, welcome.
I'm also starting my timer.
As I am.
Oh, wonderful. So My work is at the intersection of new media and technology and public health, and that really informs a lot of the way I think about our conversations about social media. So I didn't come to social media first. First, I was working with adolescents, and typically I work with Black and brown adolescents in urban spaces and think about their sexual behavior, drug use, resilience, violence, and one thing that I can impart to you that I would really like you to take away is that their voices have been largely rendered not invisible, but they've been muted. And they are invisible in conversations about science, technology, and society. Articles in communication studies and research in STS rarely privilege or acknowledge the experiences or voices. And when those are absent, when there's critique of the platforms, it's usually not related to the critiques that young people in vulnerable situations have. So when we talk about how should Facebook change, we're not thinking about how it is impacting young people of color. We're not thinking about how it's impacting poor people. We're thinking about how bullying is impacting kids in the suburbs. Or how much screen time should you allow your kid to have on the iPad while you're cooking dinner. But those are absolutely valid things to be concerned about, or privacy, but they miss what's happening in a huge part of the population. So I'm making the argument everywhere I go that Black youth and Latino youth are invisible and visible at the same time in this space. And what do I mean by that? Let me give you some examples. One, if no one else here will tell you, Black people have made the internet wonderful. Wonderful content, videos, community, activism, it is fabulous. Culture, trends, what you're saying now was created 2 years ago by probably a Black LGBT youth, right? It's not monetized for them. Other people make money off of it, but they are winning at creation on the internet. There is almost, and we know this over and over, virtually little representation of Black and brown people in the content, in platform development, in the actual digital tech space, which means the money is not ever flowing to the communities who made Vine happen, who make On Fleek, who make every single Fortnite dance that your children are doing. I don't know if your kids are doing it, but my kids, Fortnite is like the new dance. I say Fortnite ruined dance, but that's another thing. Okay, so that's one way. They're extremely visible, but largely invisible. Another way that Black youth are visible, but invisible, is they're one of the largest, they have one of the biggest uptakes of social media, of any demographic. But again, they're underrepresented in scholarship, and that's on us. This is our world. We do the research, but we are not acknowledging or studying what is happening in their communities. And what that means is it is invisible, and the ways that this invisibility manifests are, one, in my work, the risks that young people of color face online are not talked about. So, for example, and you sort of spoke to this, when my children go and play PS4, and they play, what game are they playing? Oh, it's that, it's a basketball game. Help me out now. NBA 2K. Oh gosh, they love this NBA 2K, right? And then I was like, hey, I ran past a meme, and it said someone was selling a PS4 box, or the boxes that NBA 2K is played on, and it said you can fit hundreds of racist 13-year-olds into this box. And I asked my kid, he was like, oh yeah, that's so funny. And I was like, wait a minute, when you're playing NBA 2K, are you experiencing racism? He was like, oh, all the time. People call me the N-word all the time. Because in this digital space, it's just normative. Everyone is anonymous. And so I didn't even realize that my children were facing this and considered it typical. Obviously, if you're on PS4, this is what happens. I have seen very little public scrutiny or outcry about this. Number two, we have young people who are being very strategic about what they post in terms of where they're going online, because people use check-ins to set up fights. So the check-in function, which seems like, oh, this is risk, there are some risks that we talk about. My timer's going off, but let me move on. The other two things that I think are more than interpersonal is that young people are often framed as, young people I work with are framed as at risk and problematic, and they're very aware of that. So when we enter these spaces, we do it to try to treat or intervene to solve problems, and we miss how much innovation and how much creativity and how much resilience and strategy young people are using to use tech in their world in a way that keeps them safe. We don't need to necessarily tell them what to do. We need to ask them what they're doing to navigate their environments. And finally, I do not think it is trickling down that to the kids that I work with, that their greatest threats with social media are not that someone in their school is going to find out that they're posting. It's that they are being surveilled by the criminal justice system, and it will be used against them in a court of law. And we have evidence of it over and over, that blackness is policed in a way on tech that is dangerous and problematic. And I don't think that is fully clear as people are using Snapchat and facial recognition and Instagram. Thank you.
Thank you, Robin. And then our final speaker is Rob Peguerero.
Peguerero, yes.
Good, great. Who describes himself as a freelance tech journalist.
Yeah, Yahoo Finance, USA Today, Wirecutter. Any of y'all have a freelance budget? Talk to me. And if any of you all were around here about 62 years ago, you might have run into my dad at Columbia back then. So I want to tell a story about experiencing the reality that a lot of social networks are designed without much attention to harm reduction, and with an assumption that everyone will have the same experience as their creators. And that was covering Gamergate, which, for those of you who did not have the displeasure of following this, was a basically made-up controversy over ethics in game journalism that largely manifested itself as a lot of misogynistic word vomit on Twitter towards people who dared take to task the video game industry's portrayal of various tropes. And so I wrote a piece unpacking this and explaining how awful Twitter's mechanisms for avoiding abuse and reporting it were, and thought, well, if I'm going to stick myself into this conversation, bad things could happen. I could have a really lousy day on Twitter. I might have my accounts hacked, so I spent the day before this post was going to go up on Yahoo setting up two-step verification on various things, making sure I had strong passwords. What happened the next day was nothing. If you're a white guy who appears straight who writes about Gamergate, the problem you encounter is that people won't shut up about it. Gamergaters will talk endlessly, but there's no insults about my gender, my ethnic background, my sexual orientation. I thought, wow, this is really different. Perhaps the people who designed Twitter just expected that's how everyone would be treated, because every social network they've been on before, they were not getting swarmed by people insulting, degrading who they are. And so the second story involves something that may be on many of your phones. How many people here have iPhones? Okay, thought so. Can you all check to see if you have AirDrop set to everyone? That's the wireless file transfer option. It's somewhere in the settings app, I think under general. And it seems like a great feature. You're at a conference, you want to share your deck with somebody, you beam it over to their phone, unless they have an Android phone like me, in which case we're just cut out of it. And I never really thought about, could that be exploited badly, until a few years ago, where a friend of mine experienced what is called cyber flashing, which is where someone uses AirDrop, send a picture of a tiny part of their anatomy, not their fingertips, and the preview is shown to you automatically. The really creepy part, this happened to my friend on an airplane over the Wi-Fi. The flight attendants were unable to find the offender and put him in the cargo hold. And so I thought about this afterwards. I'm going to bet the AirDrop team was a lot of white guys. And they hadn't really thought that, you know, I guess dick pics are not a part of the reality, and so that wasn't something they'd designed for. And the flip side of this, if you look at how social networks build things like login verification, two-step verification, making sure that's only you using your account, they're very good at that. They hire red teams to try to break the system they're going to put in place. How can someone defeat our attempt to make sure it's you logging into your account and not some hacker in St. Petersburg, Russia? And there does not seem to be red teaming for social network features. They build things with an eye towards their precious, precious engagement, and not thinking, how is this going to be exploited? How, when the people who never bother us online use this, what are they going to do with it? Who are they going to do that to? And so I've spent a lot of the last couple of years, after having been asleep about this stuff, trying to bring attention to this and hoping that somebody does something about it.
Thank you. So I do actually have a question for you, Todd, to get this started, and I'm not quite sure what I'm asking, but I'm gonna try it anyway. You talked about disruptions and used the analogy of emotions, and then you talked about binding agents, and you listed several. So my question is, given what you've heard about bias in technologies, platforms, apps, etc., and the damage, the potential damage for all of that, what's the relevance to your theories about, or your approach with binding agents to what you've heard, and how may that help us address some of these issues that the other panelists have raised?
So I think first let me say that it's going to get worse before it gets better, if it does get better. Hopefully by shining a light on the dark places it will get better. That's normally how society solves problems, is by sort of ferreting out the evil that goes. The reason I say it's going to get worse is augmented and virtual reality is coming. There are those who proclaim that it's an empathy machine. I actually believe the opposite, that it's a false empathy machine. Just because you put on a VR goggle for 10 minutes and go hang out with Syrian refugees doesn't mean that you magically understand their plight. Because you can take off the goggles, they can't. So empathy is something much deeper than what VR and AR can provide, and this is in part because of my theory that it still is virtual, it's not human. It's not a human interaction, it's an interaction with virtual. That doesn't mean it can't be used for good. A colleague of mine, Skip Rizzo, has been using VR to treat post-traumatic stress in returning veterans for 8 years now in a clinical setting, and it's phenomenal. So technology is agnostic. You can use it for good or you can use it for evil. I think anonymity is probably the biggest problem that we have. We have this gold standard of, would I say that to somebody in a bar? And if the answer is no, then I shouldn't type it in a comment in YouTube. But because of anonymity, we get away with that. We live in a surveillance economy. How many people in here have Alexa or use another voice agent? You're the product. And so what we find is that humans are willing to subvert their privacy and their safety for the sake of convenience, and also for the sake of addiction and play. My son is a senior at USC. He's in the game programming. He's either writing code or he's playing games 18 hours a day. And that's what he does. Now, thankfully, I forced him to study music and do some other things, so he has some interpersonal skills. But as we move further and further into the digital epoch, you will have people who can have perfectly, quote, normal relationships and never have a face-to-face conversation. Everything gets delivered and whatnot. So I think how we move towards trying to avoid some of the horrific acts is people becoming hacktivists and becoming active, and the voices have to shout out or at least respond to and not remain silent when somebody does something that's abhorrent. And I think the problem is that right now that doesn't have very much reach because of the anonymity and because the companies it's in their best interest to keep subscribers. So if you ban somebody for hate speech or for misogynist behavior, that's hurting the company's bottom line. So whether, I think it's some combination, as was noted before, it's the technologists have to be in the room for the conversation because the politicians are largely ignorant about technology. The people who are in the public health sector and who are in these areas that provide support to people who run into these problems have to be part of the conversation. So I don't have a silver bullet. Technology's going to solve problems and it's going to cause more problems, just like it ever was. So it really is about humans stepping up and doing something about it, even if it's just calling out one person. Or maybe people put their phone away for a week. And you don't have to be on Twitter and you don't have to be on Facebook. I've been lucky enough to study bass with Victor Wooten, who's with Bella Fleck and the Flecktones, and he runs a bass nature camp outside of Nashville. It's bass in nature because part of what we learn is actually getting in touch with the earth, because if you understand nature, you become a better musician and you become a better human. So maybe it's finding this balance of how do we get rid of some of the technology, keep the parts that work for us, and get rid of the parts that don't. I've stopped reading YouTube comments. I just won't read them anymore because it was making me physically ill. So you have a choice.
Soraya, let me back to the dating apps and black women in particular. So we see the issues related to the potential violence, the bias, et cetera, that you have outlined. Where are the positives of those dating apps, and black women in particular, but other marginalized populations as well? And we can ask Robin sort of the same question when it comes to black and brown youth.
So I personally don't see a whole lot of positives. And I want to go back, though, to this idea that the dating apps are a model for this bigger environment. And Todd talked about the profitability of harassment. It's immensely it's really profitable because this content, what we are the product, and it's not just us, our images, but our effective engagement. And so when you harass someone, when you engage in hate speech or misogynistic bullying, it makes a lot of money. So when Leslie Jones was harassed in Twitter, it's possible to turn that harassment into a marketable Twitter moment that says Twitter responds to Leslie Jones's racist harassment. It just becomes part of the profit machine. And that does have to do with regulation, and it does have to do with who gets to assess risk. I think we have a lot of assumptions. Like yesterday we talked about democracy as though democracy had functioned, and it was now broken. But democracy has never really functioned in the country, right? It's always been aspirational. For most of our history, most people couldn't vote. We're still dealing with that issue. And so I feel the same way about some of the ideals that we have right now in terms of values and the common good. I don't go to a lot of conferences that aren't attended purely by women where the goal of the common good is to ensure that maybe we can walk around without fear of being attacked. Maybe we could go for a walk at night, Maybe we could have our mentions opened without having random dick pics sent to us. That would be a common good, but we don't have a lot of meetings about that kind of common good. And so, this issue of anonymity, again, I think speaks very deeply to the difference in our experiences. In fact, most women are attacked online by people they know, not by anonymous malefactors. And that is true offline, too. Most of the harassment and stalking and assaults that women suffer come from people they know. So online, when we're harassed, it's much more likely to come from a classmate, a neighbor, the bus driver that we see every day, an ex-spouse, right? So if your chances of being raped are 1 in 3 to 1 in 5, instead of 1 in 77, then a threat of rape online is perceived differently. And one of the issues for me in any of this is this quality of emotional resonance. The people making decisions in these organizations are not having the same types of emotionally resonant experiences as the most vulnerable people on their platforms. So we've created systems in which we privilege the experiences of the least vulnerable. They establish the rules for what is free speech, what is safety, what is threat, what is reasonable conduct, and the rest of us have to dance around those rules at great cost. And that comes to money. So today, only 2% of venture capital money goes to organizations led by women, less than 10% to organizations that have people of color. And so the really horrific fact to me is that most of the people surveyed in venture capital or in Wall Street who look at those, they look at those numbers and they pat themselves on the back. They're on the record saying, we're doing a really good job. And that's just bizarre, right? And so you really have to get to the issue of cognition. Why would someone who's intelligent and theoretically motivated make an assumption or a decision like that? Because we're not doing a good job at all. If we could have really inclusive spaces where more people were sharing their experiences. I mean, the whole industry works on a fast thinking model, which means experience becomes much more important. And if you only have a very narrow band of experience, you're going to be really piss poor at risk assessment, which is how we ended up with the election, right? People are really, it's entirely possible to have been shocked by Trump's election, but not really surprised. There were people who were shocked and surprised because they just didn't see it coming. You know who saw it coming? Black women saw it coming, right? Like 99% of them did not vote for Trump. And so the question is, why are our spaces not inclusive? And it's because, as everyone's been saying, people have to give up their privilege. And nobody likes doing that.
Robin, any positives in terms of even your own children and how they use this technology, social media platforms?
So I make for me, it helps me to think about the digital world as a digital neighborhoods, right? And so in our digital neighborhoods, we each exist in them. They're different. Some of us have great ones. Some of us have really problematic digital neighborhoods, and the young people are in them as well. And if you've ever spent any time in a neighborhood that has ever been called under-resourced, marginalized, low income, and if you ever do any work in those neighborhoods, the people who live there will often say, I love my neighborhood. My neighborhood is great, but, right? There is beauty and wonderful community support often in places that seem like there would be none. And in the same way, in the digital space, the digital neighborhoods of the Black youth that I've worked with have some amazing assets that we should all be so lucky to have in our neighborhoods in terms of support, in terms of content creation, in terms of humor, in terms of activism, but there are also real threats in their neighborhood that they may not create on their own, but they have to navigate. So some of the positive things, clearly to me, are they still come at a cost, though. Our people are able to connect with each other who may not have been able to connect in their neighborhood because their neighborhood was not safe. But we also see that connection comes at a cost. So typically when I ask young people how do they feel about digital media or their neighborhood, they're like, it's a necessary evil, but sometimes I walk away feeling worse. So I can't let go of it, but I don't always feel good after engaging in it. So it's bittersweet, I guess.
If I could just add, the one thing to keep in mind, though, is that even in the analog world, things have a cost. So there's no free lunch. So I've seen the same thing with communities, digital communities, where I've met people all over the world. We join on these various online sites around communities of practice or communities of interest. A member dies, and people I don't know, I had $7,000 in PayPal sent to me so that I could give it to the family from people that I didn't even know. So I think we have to just keep in mind that there's a cost, whether we're analog or digital. It's how do we keep it in balance, because I think we are wildly unchecked in the digital side towards the misogynist and the abusive and the positive. So we're out of whack. And again, it comes down to that, would I say this in a bar sort of mnemonic that is a little bit easier and a little bit more balanced in the analog?
But I want to challenge you a little bit. I think the costs of me in the digital neighborhood are much lower than they are for young people who, if they say the wrong thing, they might get beat up at school. Do you know
Totally
what
agree.
I
Absolutely
think it's
agree.
a different
There's a generational spectrum, so that as somebody who's a white male who's 57, I'm pretty okay in the digital world, and I will just get annoyed, but that's about it. My son, who is 22, I worry a lot more about. What the ones that I really worry about are the ones who are teens and even earlier, and especially the ones whose parents don't play games and aren't active in those communities, so they don't know. I mean, it is the proverbial, the kids are going off. It's like, would you let your 8-year-old kid, 30 years ago say, hey, I'm going to go downtown, I'm going to hitchhike, and then I'll be back maybe around 4 or 5 in the morning? And we would have said no, but that's exactly what my son was doing in his teen years. Now, I am active in the games, I build games and whatnot, so I kind of knew what was going on, but a lot of people don't. And that's the real danger, I think.
Rob, any signs of hope from your perspective, and then we'll open it up to questions and comments from
Yeah,
the
I
audience.
still don't think we're doomed, although as a journalist I have to be optimistic at some level. I would say, so in Twitter, one thing they have done better is stop focusing on, identify the bad actor and block them, which has been the response of every social network ever. And I'm old enough to remember what Usenet news groups were like in the 90s. It cracks me up when 20-something tech bros from Silicon Valley repeat every mistake we made back then. So now it's easier to just say, you can't be replied to by accounts that are new, that just have the default avatar, that haven't been verified with a phone number. Go after mechanisms that make it easy for bots, trolls, and otherwise useless people to go after you. I think that's a positive step. The fact that I guess the quality filter was once only available to verified users, now everyone has it. I should note one funny detail about this Gamergate piece. I think Twitter verified my account the day that came out, so I very much enjoyed biting the hand that fed me. And there's lots of little changes you could make. So about AirDrop, the fix for that, when you make your phone discoverable via Bluetooth, it's not for all time, it's for the next 2 minutes. Have AirDrop be everyone only for the next 2 minutes, so you can exchange that slide deck at the conference, and then it goes back to contacts only or it's off. There's no use case for that being open all the time. The people who use Venmo, having that be public by default is idiotic and abusive, and they need to change it, but they still haven't.
Thank you all. We will, let's hear from the audience, and then we'll have you, as with the last panel, you can respond and react to things that we hear. So are there any comments or questions from anyone in the audience? Right here and then right here.
Hi, my name is Nia Moya, and I am a student at Union Theological Seminary. My question is regarding something that you mentioned earlier about who perceives risk and who decides what is normative. My question is, who's in the room, who's typically in the room when these decisions are being made? And on top of that, who should be in the room when these decisions are being made? Other than we can say women need to be in the room, people of color need to be in the room, but beyond race and gender, maybe what kind of professionals need to be in the room to kind of speak to these issues in a deeper level? Is it people who work in psychological fields? Like who are the people who are usually brought in to even kind of start to tackle these questions? And in your opinion, who else needs to be in that room?
Lawyers.
Lawyers need to be in the room?
No, lawyers are in the room.
Oh. Yeah.
It's what's my risk as a company? That's the first. In the way old days of technology, they weren't even the lawyers. It was just the programmers. That when you're doing a
But I
startup.
think there's still a lot, it's programmers. So, I mean, I have worked with Facebook and Twitter and Google, and the issue is not even a digital issue, right? Because 93% of Twitter's engineers are men. 40% to 90% of the industry is young men who are either white or Asian. And they're doing the programming, they're doing the product design. And the industry is not only male dominated in that way, but it's also sex segregated functionally. So in these companies a lot, it's the case that products are being built really fast. They're going really, really fast. And they don't have multidisciplinary input from ethicists or philosophers or, you know, just a wide range of people who might be considering harm. And then problems happen, and cleanup squads come in. And the cleanup squads are heavily women, right? And they're doing security, customer service, privacy. And so there are some great notions of digital housewives and what that means. But basically, I mean, Facebook reorganized last fall, and Recode put out an org chart, and there were 15 or 16 men, and they were in all these new product roles. And there was one woman, I kid you not, her title was Vice President of Integrity. And that's like some kind of funny, weird, current, like Republican womanhood shit, right? And so you see that over and over and over again, that the women are tasked with the trust and the safety and the care and the emotional labor after the risk has been taken and harm has been shown over and over and over again. And that doesn't have anything to do with the tech. That has to do with the fundamental separate sphere theories of our society, right? Who do we think in our society can do math, right? Boys do math. But boys do better at math here, but girls in Japan do better than American boys. So it's clearly not like a gender thing, you know?
And
It
you're
also
starting.
suggests that we should be training people in things other than just doing math. I mean, if we're going to, if these are the people who are going to be designing and developing, then if they're not going to get that level, you know, this is my business, right? That level of formation at home,
Right.
then there's an
In
obligation
school.
on the part of the institutions that are developing them to do it. I'm
So
sorry.
this
Todd.
is part of why we're completely revamping the curriculum at Party Rand, acknowledging that technology is changing everything, and our gender balance in our PhD program is actually, we have more women than men in the program. I'm starting to see that in the sciences as well. So there is some slow sort of evolution. It will take time for that to build up through the system. But the other problem that you have is when things do go wrong, then the companies look to greenwash themselves. So Facebook will now have an ethicist in residence, and they'll have an artist in residence. So they'll basically pay lip service to being multicultural and interdisciplinary. And my argument has always been that in order to solve these problems, you can't leave the technologists to their own devices. In part because they're driven by profit, and that's okay, that's what capitalism runs on, but they also, a lot of them are not broadly trained. So you have to, that's why I always argue that artists and musicians and social scientists, and I actually believe in a liberal arts education, even for engineers, God forbid, because you can't, the mantra of our lab is applications and implications. If anybody builds an application in our tech and narrative lab, they have to do a deep dive into the implications and second and third order effects of what that application is going to do. And so we're trying to change it one set of people and students at a time and sort of make that viral as it goes out. And again, we have a choice in this, but the choice shouldn't be to just bury yourself in your phone and say, well, it'll all get better and the companies will solve it. Because the companies exist to make money. They don't exist to make your life better.
Thank you. The question here, and then I think we probably need to wrap up. I think we're a little bit over time, but as with the previous panel, we started late, so.
So again, my name is Tony Hatch, and I have a question for anyone who wants to tackle it about this promissory rhetoric around regulation, that the idea, the fundamental premise that you can regulate a corporation to do the right thing, and that it would be a state that would govern regulation that would change how corporations act. That's not the purpose of states, in my understanding. The purpose of the state is to facilitate the capitalist exchange. So I worry about that. So can anyone kind of speak to that kind of promissory rhetoric of regulation?
Just because I write about technology doesn't mean I know how to use it. So yeah, one thing to watch out for, a lot of the calls for regulation of social networks these days are coming from, I would not say conservatives, I would say right-wingers, because the government telling companies how to run their own affairs is not usually a doctrine of conservative economic thought. And the problem they seek to solve is that companies like Facebook and Twitter are too mean to conservatives, I mean right-wingers, which seems sort of silly given who's the president again? What does he do on Twitter? So that's already politically loaded, and so calls for regulation are liable to get pushed into the direction of ensuring that there's fairness and balance in social networks, which A, how are you going to do that? B, is going to become a way for whoever's in charge of the government to start controlling what sort of gets amplified in social media. It's a problem, but I don't think, as the token DC guy here, that the government is well positioned to solve, or maybe should even try to solve.
I think the government, though, has a history of trying to regulate technology. It did with automation. You can argue whether it was a success or a failure. I think the problem that we have here is not so much that they're going to have a tough time regulating technology, because they've always had a tough time regulating technology. It's the fact that digital is fundamentally different. What digital does is it scales in a way that we have never seen before. When you build a factory, there's only so many factories that you can build. When I make an app, I can make an infinite number of copies of that app. And so with that, combined with AI, machine learning, virtual humans, right now, I have the ability in my lab, and soon it will be on your desktop, to create a virtual version of any human, living or dead, and I can make them do and say anything I want them to, and it will be imperceptible to most people. That is a technological capability humanity has never seen before. We need to figure out how to get ahead of that. If you leave it to the companies to decide how to do that, I don't think that's our best approach, because again, it comes down to money, as was said before. It's in their financial interest to do those capabilities. So government is going to have to regulate this one way or another. We will do like we did with drones. Drones had no regulation. Then all of a sudden drones are flying near airports. They swung the pendulum to no drones anymore. And then there was a cry from industry that, well, the Russians are going to beat us in drone technology. So now we have regulations about regulating FAA pilots and whatnot. So these are really, really wicked hard problems. But again, it's why those who are in the public policy space, at least some of the people, are having conversations like this and trying to move us forward in a thoughtful way. It's really hard.
Can I just say one thing about that too? A lot of the work that I do is international, and this question of regulation is so tricky because of jurisdictional issues, but really it speaks deeply to the fact that the technology doesn't respect borders, and we have huge issues with migrants and refugees, but we don't really talk about the migrancy of ideas and what it means. I personally don't think that government's going to solve this. I really think it is sort of multidisciplinary, multi-level human endeavor. that we don't understand.
So as a Presbyterian minister from across the street, and hearing these last two sets of comments, just a few concluding thoughts I have probably very little to do with the hard stuff of technology. That is, one is that we have to be careful not to make a golden calf of technology, if I can use that phrase, in the sense that this is not something we should be worshiping, but I think society does in all of its dimensions, and that's what gets us in trouble in the first place. It is not a God, it is a thing, and we should remember that. Secondly, I would say that we need the values people in the room. The values people need to be in the room from the very beginning. And a fundamental question has to be asked of what use is this to enabling, enhancing people, increasing people's value. Not how we can manipulate folks and make $1 off people, but how can we make people better with this? If we fail at that, then this thing is going to kill us in its many dimensions. But if we struggle with how do we put some parameters around it and use it for good, then it just might ultimately, and in the balance, be used for good. I could do a benediction, but that I'd just say let's stop and move on to the next panel. Thank you.
Greetings, everyone. Please have a seat. We're going directly to this next panel. My name is James Fallows from The Atlantic. I'm making a return engagement after the panel yesterday afternoon. And this has been a fascinating sequence of panels this morning as it was yesterday. I'm going to spend just a minute trying to provide some connective tissue between where we started yesterday, where we're going the rest of today, and what I hope we're going to learn in these next few minutes, which I'm really looking forward to. For reasons I'll explain to you in a moment, I will not be able to be at the end of the panel later today. I have a good excuse. I will just tell you in a moment. But what I would say if I were going to be around then is how impressive it is that all eyes forward, please. Yes. So how impressive it is that the people planning this conference, this gathering, it's been as if there were an actual strategy here, an actual way in which we're trying to have us share things we've learned, we wonder about, and move on to action long term. We've heard from people from a wide variety of backgrounds. We've had technologists, we've had people at national level politics, international level politics, local level politics, activism and engagement of all kinds. We've had scholars, we've had lawyers, and there's a range of 20 other categories we've heard from. And they've shared impressions of the ways in which the technology of this moment, how we communicate with each other, how we communicate intimately and in large scale, is changing for better and worse the fundamental things that people have always tried to do, tried to govern themselves, trying to understand reality, trying to protect individuals or failing to protect individuals, trying to separate signal from noise when it comes to perceiving the world around us. Yesterday, Eric Schnur properly corrected me in my attribution of the quote that I was saying from Herman Talmadge. It was actually George Smathers, of criticizing a political rival by saying that his sister was a known thespian. Here's actually a correct quote that applies to what we're doing. This is from Adlai Stevenson, back when he was running for president. He said the role of the press the role of editors was to separate the wheat from the chaff and then print the chaff. So this is a longstanding challenge in our business. And so we've had analyses of the challenges we are dealing with, but we also have had suggestions of what to do in this new environment, this fast-changing environment, how people in the different sectors we're talking about, the faith community, the university community, politicians, technologists, how they could try to use this clearer understanding